Ice cream! Get your ice cream!
Sit back, relax, and turn on your Tell Me Vision. TV debuts of 1967. 1967 had some big successes, but also some notable failures. No matter how you look at it, this was an interesting year for new TV shows. Action shows. Dragnet, 1967. Dragnet was always cool, whether it was the black and white series from the 1950s or the color series from the 1960s. In a lot of ways, this version of Dragnet became the definitive version. Jack Webb was still Joe Friday. This time around, his partner was Bill Gannon, played by Harry Morgan. Morgan was very good for the show, and the two worked well together. The show sometimes covered heavy subject matter, but Morgan could interject with some much-needed comedy. The gimmick of this Dragnet series is that the title would change every season to the year it would next end. Ultimately, the show ran until Dragnet 1970. The stories were true, but names were changed. Joe Friday and Bill Gannon were fictional characters that represented the actual policemen who solved these crimes. Because these were real cases, and this show was always pitched as a public service message of sorts, they could get away with talking about a lot of stuff other TV shows didn't dare touch, like rape, heavy drug use, hate crimes, and kids getting killed, among other things. Gentle Ben. This family adventure show centers on a family and their tame bear named Ben. It ran on CBS for 2 seasons of 58 episodes and is surprisingly well remembered despite its short run. The show continued to be shown in reruns for years, and Gentle Ben himself made public appearances at circuses and other events through the 1970s. Ironside. This ran for 8 seasons on NBC. Raymond Burr had an impressive acting career, but there are really 2 characters for which he is known: Perry Mason and Ironside. This was a different kind of detective show. Ironside was a wheelchair-bound consultant for the San Francisco Police Department. He had been the chief of detectives, but a would-be assassin's bullet left him paralyzed. Now he had to rely on his brains and swagger to solve crimes. Mannix. This series is awesome. It ran an impressive 8 seasons on CBS. The first season, however, is radically different from the rest of the series. At that time, Joe Mannix worked for a high-tech detective agency called Intertect. He was an old-fashioned detective and despised the computers the agency so heavily relied on. His boss, however, was also his friend. Joseph Campanella played Lou Wickersham, Joe's superior. This was actually a good character, and besides Mike Connors, the star, was a bright spot in this odd season. From season 2 onward, Mannix became the show we know today. Joe Mannix was now a private detective, working on his own. It was explained that he had quit Intertect. From here on, the first season was largely ignored. He had a pretty black secretary named Peggy Fair, played by Gail Fisher. With all due respect to Joseph Campanella, Gail Fisher was a much better sidekick for Joe Mannix. To call Peggy just a secretary is underscoring things. She was definitely more of an assistant or an associate. Peggy did a lot of things that went above and beyond the call of duty for a secretary. The writing of this series, even in season 1, is beyond belief. Much of the time, in an episode of Mannix, you never really know what's going on, but there's a whole lot of activity. In about the last 15 minutes of the show, everything ties together, makes perfect sense, and leaves you thinking, dang, that was clever. Maya. This adventure show lasted only 1 season. It starred Jay North, who had previously been the star of Dennis the Menace. In this show, a teenage Jay and his Indian friend's elephant, named Maya, travel around India looking for his missing father. It's a follow-up to the film of the same name that came out the previous year. It lasted only 1 season of 18 episodes on NBC. NYPD. This serious cop show starred Jack Warden and aired on ABC for 2 seasons. He and his 2 other detective buddies solved crimes all over New York City. A lot of the stories were based on true cases. It seemed to be a New York-style ripoff of Dragnet that ultimately didn't take. Children's shows. CBS Children's Film Festival. In a way, this was a follow-up to the popular Kukla, Fran, and Ollie kids show. Fran Allison and her famous puppets hosted this show that featured live-action films made for kids from around the world. It was shown on Saturdays. In 1977, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie were dropped from the show, and it was renamed to CBS Saturday Film Festival. The show got canceled in 1978. It was brought back in 1982, but canceled for good in 1984. Comedy shows. The Carol Burnett Show. This comedy variety show became the stuff of TV legend. It lasted for 11 seasons of 279 one-hour episodes. It made a star of everyone who appeared on it, and if someone was already a star before this, it made them even more famous. Carol Burnett herself became even more famous thanks to this series. Besides Carol, the most successful star of this show would be Tim Conway. Strange enough, he was just a recurring guest performer for the first 8 seasons, but was on the show so much he was considered a regular. Tim was not an official regular cast member until the 9th season. He worked a lot in television and movies before, during, and after the Carol Burnett Show. The Danny Thomas Hour. This is a hard show to define, and it's not 100% comedy. Maybe that's why this only lasted 1 season of 22 episodes. It's an anthology series that mixes comedies, dramas, and musical variety hours. He at least hosted all of them, but didn't star in the dramas. This certainly was not the hit that his sitcom, The Danny Thomas Show, had been. People like to know what to expect with a TV show, and with the Danny Thomas Hour, they just didn't. Consistency is important. It just doesn't pay to be too different. The Flying Nun. This wildly popular show ran on ABC for 3 seasons. Sally Field starred as the title character, a nun with the ability to fly. Although this is an easy-to-take kind of show, it's still very weird. Around this time period, it seems TV couldn't get enough of women characters in fantasy comedies. Bewitched got the ball rolling in 1964 about a sexy witch. Also in that year, there was My Living Doll about a woman robot. Then I Dream of Jeannie in 1965 with a genie named Jeannie. All the bases were getting covered, so why not a show about a flying nun? Good Morning World. This show aired on CBS for just 1 season of 26 episodes. It's amazing that this show keeps getting played in reruns from time to time and keeps being rediscovered. It didn't do very well at the time. The show centers on 2 disc jockeys who work for a small AM station in Los Angeles. This series leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I say that because it has good people involved with it, but it's just not a very good show. Carl Reiner and Sheldon Leonard normally didn't miss with shows they created, but this one just didn't have it. Ronnie Shell, one of the 2 male leads, was always a dependable comic actor and someone you like to see in shows, but in this particular series, he just doesn't seem to dazzle. Goldie Hawn, who I have always really enjoyed, had her first professional role in this series as a friend to one of their wives, but she just hadn't become the Goldie we know. Fortunately, Ronnie Shell was able to go back to Gomer Pyle USMC, and Goldie started her run on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, where she became a superstar. Both of these were much better shows to be attached to. He and She. This show, like Good Morning World, also ran on CBS for just 1 season of 26 episodes. Unlike that series, this one isn't remembered very well at all. Today, a lot of TV historians consider this show ahead of its time. Ironically, it was like a prototype of the MTM Enterprises lineup of sitcoms that were so popular in the 1970s, like The Mary Tyler Moore Show, that began in 1970. The character of Oscar in this series was the pattern for the later Ted Baxter character in The Mary Tyler Moore Show. It starred real-life married couple Richard Benjamin and Paula Prentice as husband and wife in the show. He was a successful cartoonist and creator of the superhero Jetman, She was a social worker. The character of Jetman was so popular that it had been turned into a network television series. Obviously, this show was spoofing the popularity of TV's Batman at the time. Jack Cassidy played Oscar North, the egotistical actor who played Jetman. Oscar North always argues with the creator of Jetman over the interpretation of the character. Today, this show wouldn't be considered that revolutionary. In 1967, it did a lot of things that were considered different. Real married couples playing husband and wife on screen was, surprisingly, still a novelty, although it had been done plenty times before. The spoofing of high-profile pop culture wasn't all that regular on TV back then. Now, just about every comedy show has done it since at least the 1990s. The idea of the working wife was also very new on television, as most married women were still portrayed as housewives. The Jerry Lewis Show. This is the second series that went by this name. This one was on NBC and lasted 2 seasons. It was a traditional comedy variety show. Besides the fact Jerry Lewis was a big star, this show was never a great rating success. Not even time slot changes could save it. This got stomped on in the ratings by just about every show it ran against. The Jonathan Winters Show. This variety show starred legendary comedian Jonathan Winters. It ran for only 2 seasons, but is still very well remembered. Not just for Jonathan Winters himself, but his mix of extremely popular comedians and musicians. While most of these guests were considered clean, safe entertainment at the time, Jonathan also had on people that were deemed controversial, like The Doors and the Smothers Brothers. Jonathan worked on TV a lot before and after this, as well as movies, so he never truly went away. The Mothers-in-Law. What happens when Desi Arnaz tries to produce a show on his own, without Lucille Ball and the famed Desilu Productions? Something like The Mothers-in-Law. Under the company name of Desi Arnaz Productions, he made this show that ran just 2 seasons on NBC. It didn't become as popular as anything Lucy starred in or produced. Heck, even Lucy's final flop of a TV series, Life with Lucy, gets talked about more than The Mothers-in-Law, and that show lasted less than 2 months. This isn't a bad show by any means, but it just didn't have the oomph it needed to compete with other shows of the day. Where did this show go wrong? For one thing, the actors were good enough, but there was no standout character. There wasn't a character you were going to see made into toys, that's for sure. The concept wasn't all that exciting. A young couple gets married and the parents of both do things to interfere. Not too mind-blowing. In addition to that, the show went through cast changes and format changes in its short run. It's amazing that the show lasted as long as it did with just 2 seasons. The first season was not a rating success, and the second season fared worse, but NBC really wanted this Desi Arnaz produced series to take. It just didn't. Rango. This Western comedy series starred Tim Conway, but lasted only 17 episodes on ABC. He had been a regular on McHale's Navy from 1962 to 66. ABC was having success with F Troop, another Western comedy series, so it can be assumed this is where they drew the inspiration. However, that series would end shortly before this one was canceled. Tim Conway never had success when he was leading a TV series, for whatever reason, but was successful in his own movies and, later on, his own comedy videos. Tim Conway himself poked fun at how his own show seemed to flop. When it came to TV, he got more acclaim as a supporting player. The Carol Burnett Show became a big part of his career. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. On September 9th, 1967, the pilot episode for this soon-to-be revolutionary series first aired. The actual series did not start until 1968. It ran until 1973. The format of this show was extremely unique at the time. It inspired all other sketch comedy shows that followed it, including Saturday Night Live. When Laugh-In came out, a lot of TV comedy shows and even cartoons tried to rip it off. It was popular for having a very large ensemble cast, lots of quick cuts and sight gags. Although much of the show was still family friendly, there was a good amount of material that was considered very topical and controversial at the time. Not surprising, it saw a lot of censorship. In the late 1960s, there were two shows that got beat up by the censors more than anyone. Laugh-In was one, Smothers Brothers was the other. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. I love the Smothers Brothers. They had been around for a while, and even had their own short-lived sitcom before this. But this is the Smothers Brothers show everyone remembers, and the one that saw a number of revivals over the years. It ran for 3 controversial seasons on CBS. It was really deemed more controversial by CBS than anyone else, and the network butted heads with the brothers on a weekly basis. It became the stuff of TV legend, and the power struggle between the two factions was well publicized at the time. The show was really not that edgy. They didn't say bad language or have any sex or nudity. The show was totally against the Vietnam War, a sentiment shared by just about everyone, and the politicians that kept the strife going, be they Democrat or Republican. CBS, at that time, didn't want anything topical on their network, and they especially didn't want to lose any potential money from politicians who wanted to pay them for airtime. The Smothers Brothers were also against stupid censorship. Not all censorship, but things that were really dumb. For instance, they had musical guests on the show a lot of other TV shows wouldn't dare to have on, including The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, and Ike and Tina Turner, to name a few. There was nothing wrong with these groups, but for various reasons were deemed controversial at the time. The show also made a number of drug references, particularly to marijuana. They never showed anyone doing drugs, but the jokes were there, and even that was considered a no-no by stodgy network executives. The problem was that marijuana was so prevalent at the time that it would have been an opportunity missed not to joke about it. Nothing the Smothers Brothers did was dark humor. As a matter of fact, much of what they did was still family-friendly fare that didn't have any kind of message behind it at all, other than just being funny. Unfortunately for the brothers, CBS got tired of their shenanigans and fired them after 3 seasons, effectively ending the show. On the flip side of things, it didn't kill their career at all, and they remained very popular for decades after. They even came back to CBS after a while. Dramas and soap operas. CBS Playhouse. This lasted for 3 seasons, although only 12 episodes were produced. Each was 90 minutes. This is not a series you will hear people talk about too much today, but at the time it had a lot of Emmy nominations, winning some of these among other awards. These TV movies were heavy drama. Love is a many-splendored thing. As far as soap operas go, this did not have an impressive run. Most successful soap operas last decades. This one just lasted 6 years. That would be a great run for just about any other kind of TV show, but not for soap operas. Even worse, the vast majority of these episodes are lost today. These were recorded on videotape at CBS, and the tapes were routinely wiped for reuse. Finding an episode of this show, even in lousy kinescope form, is a grand pursuit. Today, only about 7 episodes of the 1,430 made are known to exist. Seeing them is another matter, as they generally fall into the hands of private collectors. There is one public domain episode, however, that you can find on the internet. This soap opera was unique at the time for focusing heavily on young characters. Later on, more successful soap operas like One Life to Live and All My Children followed this formula, but Love is a Many-Splendored Thing was the first to go against the grain of focusing on wealthy people over 30. A number of actors who became much more famous later on appeared on this series, including Donna Mills, Paul Michael Glaser, and B.B. Besch, to name just a few. Superhero shows. When the Batman TV series came out the previous year and proved to be a hit, the camp superhero craze was at an all-time high. There were many silly superhero TV shows, cartoons, and movies produced from all over the world. Europe made a lot of corny superhero movies in the vein of Batman, and they held on to the craze much longer, through the 1970s. Captain Nice. This show bombed and lasted only 15 episodes on NBC. William Daniels was the star. He was a police chemist who drank a formula that turned him into instant superhero. It aired on Monday nights, just like the similar series of Mr. Terrific. This show was also not a success and lasted only 17 episodes on CBS. Alan Young, who played Wilbur Post on TV's Mr. Ed, was the original choice for the character and even starred in the unaired pilot. But things fell through and the role went to an actor by the name of Stephen Strimple. Perhaps if Young, a much more experienced and recognizable actor, was in the series, it would have proven more popular. As it stands, this is one of those rare TV shows that struggles to maintain even a cult following. It was 1 day short of the 4-month mark. In the series, a gas station attendant named Stanley Beamish takes a power pill to become Mr. Terrific. In his super form, he has the strength of 1,000 men and can fly, but is still vulnerable to bullets. The pills only last an hour, and he finds himself losing his powers at the most inopportune times. He does, however, have 10-minute booster pills. Mr. Terrific works for the government and keeps his identity a secret. Ultra 7. This Japanese superhero show is one of those things that, although not well known to Americans at the time, later developed a following like most Japanese media. It is actually the third entry in the Ultra series, following the original Ultra Q, then Ultraman. The Ultras were giant-sized alien superheroes. The idea of giant superheroes in Japanese TV shows became very popular, ultimately influencing shows like Power Rangers decades later. Captain Ultra. This is another Japanese superhero show, but is not connected to the Ultra series, except in name. As a matter of fact, it was made by a different studio. Despite having only 24 episodes, it's one of the more popular Japanese superhero shows from this time period. Captain Ultra is a space hero. He has a robot companion named Huck. He also has an alien friend named Joe, and a beautiful space cadet named Akane, who has secret agent gadgets. Johnny Sacco and his flying robot. This Japanese superhero show was pretty wild. It lasted 1 season. A boy controls a giant robot that he uses to fight a terrorist organization. The enemies are wildly bizarre. It's colorful and optimistic, but the way it's done is totally nuts. Hey, that's part of the charm. Talk shows. Donahue. This long-running talk show ran until 1996. His kind of talk show was the precursor to all of the talk shows that came out in the 1980s and 90s. His first guest was the atheist Madeline Murray O'Hare, the woman who fought to get public prayer out of school. Right from the jump, he tackled some extremely controversial and taboo subjects. But in the early days, he also did a lot more focus on musical guests and celebrity guests and things like that, fluff material. But he quickly advanced to doing almost entirely controversial subjects, things that were going to make people stand up on end. It was a local show at first, and by 1970, Donahue became nationwide, and he became a big, big star. He wasn't always shown on every channel across the United States because some people just found his show just a little bit too edgy. But he was extremely important and highly visible. Although Donahue still tried to play it straight, other talk show hosts took it into crazier territories. He soon got outshined by the likes of Geraldo Rivera, Sally Jesse Raphael, and especially Jerry Springer. What a lot of people fail to realize nowadays is just how extremely popular Phil Donahue and his talk show was. In the 1980s, before anyone knew about Oprah Winfrey, Donahue was the talk show guy. Pat Boone in Hollywood. This combination talk show variety show lasted only 1 season. Western shows. Western TV shows were just about totally dead by 1967. The genre had played out, but it was established, so you can't blame the networks for trying to keep them going. However, different things had to be done with westerns, to try to make them more marketable. This was not a successful mission, but it led to some interesting experimentation. Cimarron Strip. This ran for only one season of 23 episodes on CBS. Quite frankly, one season was all it really needed. This was one of only 3 Western TV shows in the 1960s to be 90 minutes long. The other 2 were The Virginian and, for one season, Wagon Train. Besides the long running time, this is a fairly straight-ahead Western that focuses on a U.S. Marshal. Cowboy in Africa. Chuck Connors, star of The Rifleman, was in this one-season flop where he played a rodeo cowboy who moves to Africa. He even has an Indian companion. You could consider this a modern-day Western. It's a different concept for sure, but not one that everyone will be interested in. Some people just like Westerns in Western settings. Custer. This lasted just one season of 17 episodes on ABC. It's based loosely on the real George Armstrong Custer. There were a few problems with making a series about Custer. For one thing, everybody knows that he ends up getting slaughtered. It's hard to get invested in the character. Second, the show was accused of glamorizing Custer. So much so that a protest headed by Indians got the series canceled due to the FCC Fairness Doctrine. The Indians killed Custer twice! Dundee and the Colhane. This Western drama series lasted just one season of 13 episodes on CBS. It tried to merge the two genres of Western and legal drama, but fell flat. The show centered on 2 frontier lawyers in the Old West. If you think this show sounds like a big yawn, then you're in good company. So did a lot of people. After 3 months, CBS decided to replace it, wisely, with The Jonathan Winter Show. The Guns of Will Sonnet. Although this only lasted for 2 seasons, it is still well liked today. It actually had a proper series finale. Walter Brennan and Dak Rambo were the stars. The High Chaparral. Unlike most Western TV shows that started in the late 1960s, this one actually did well and lasted for 4 seasons on NBC. There was nothing really unique about this Western, so it must have been the cast that audiences liked. This show starred Leif Erikson and Cameron Mitchell, 2 guys who knew their way around a Western. Hondo. This lasted for just a little over 3 months and only 17 episodes on ABC. Why did the series flop? As mentioned, the late 1960s was hard for Westerns anyway. Besides that, there were 3 big factors. This series was based off the John Wayne movie of the same name, and it didn't star John Wayne. Fans of the Duke weren't going to accept his little-known substitute, Ralph Tager. Second, the movie that came before this was from 1953, 14 years earlier. If this show really wanted to ride off the success of that film, they should have made this years earlier. Finally, it was going up against the already established and super popular shows of Gomer Pyle USMC on CBS and Star Trek on NBC. This show just didn't have a chance at all. Other TV events of 1967. The very first Super Bowl was held on January 15th, 1967. At this time, it was called the AFL-NFL World Championship Game. It was shown on both CBS and NBC. The Kansas City Chiefs played the Green Bay Packers. The Packers won. Jack and the Beanstalk on NBC starred Gene Kelly and was made by Hanna-Barbera. It was the first TV special to combine live action and animation. Our World was a historic television special that aired on June 25th. It was the first live, worldwide, via satellite TV broadcast. It aired in 24 countries and had a viewership estimated from 400 to 700 million people, the largest television audience at that time. 2 hours long, it talked about various things happening in the world, but is most famous for its many musical guests, including the Beatles, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton, Keith Moon of The Who, and many others. The Fugitive, which had been on since 1963, was an extremely popular TV series. Its final episode becomes one of the most watched TV episodes of the decade. October 1st, 1967 is the first time someone appears nude in a television program. It happened in the Netherlands on a show called Hopla from the VPRO broadcaster. A female model by the name of Phil Bloom is seen reading a newspaper. When she folds the newspaper, she is completely nude. The first Nancy Sinatra TV special, Movin' with Nancy, aired on December 11th and was a major hit. It had 2 sequel specials. This one had some big guest stars, including Frank Sinatra Jr., Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Art Linkletter. The Beatles made a TV musical film. Magical Mystery Tour aired December 26th on BBC One. Although filmed in color, and it needed color, it was shown in black and white. This movie was not well received and was the Beatles' first critical failure. It was later re-aired on January 5th, 1968 on BBC Two, so it could be shown in its proper color. This also failed, as there were only about 200,000 color TVs in the UK at that time. Paul McCartney took much of the blame for this film's failure, even going so far as making a public apology. It would be years before this movie was appreciated, but has been better received in the years since, reaching iconic status. TV celebrity debuts of 1967. Ed Begley Jr. as Marv in the My Three Sons episode, The Computer Picnic. It took him a while to really reach star status, but by the 1980s and 90s he was all over the place, especially when St. Elsewhere started in 1982. Candice Bergen as Enid Toller in the Coronet Blue episode, The Rebels. She was the daughter of legendary ventriloquist Edgar Bergen, famous for Charlie McCarthy. When she was a child, she had appeared on his radio show. Before this TV show, she even made a few film appearances. Candice had actually been successful as a model before she took up acting. Initially, she was seen more in movies than she was on television for many years. Beginning in 1975, she became a frequent guest host on Saturday Night Live. This was so popular for her that she did even more work on TV. In 1988, she landed the title role in the long-running sitcom Murphy Brown. This is perhaps the role for which she will always be best known. Cher as Ramona in the Man from U.N.C.L.E. episode, The Hot Number Affair. She was in her first movie 2 years earlier, but this was her first TV appearance. Besides her extremely successful singing career, Cher would go on to do many movies and TV appearances. Timothy Dalton as Peter in Saturday While Sunday. He went on to have a long and fantastic career in stage, screen, and television. Timothy has been nearly typecast as James Bond for his 2 film appearances as the legendary hero spy. Fortunately for him, he kept working steadily and diversified his roles. To give an example of how good this British actor became, he once played a corrupt southern sheriff, quite convincingly, in the action movie Made Men. Antonio Fargas in Ironside. Before he was Huggy Bear in Starsky and Hutch, he played T.D. Harris in the pilot movie for this legendary series. Fargas actually had a full career, but everyone knows him for Huggy Bear. Goldie Hawn as Sandy Kramer in Good Morning World. Her first thing on TV or anything, and it was as a series regular in a sitcom. Not too bad for a start. The sitcom only lasted a season, but it got her into Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In and all the fantastic stuff that followed, particularly her film career. Eric Idle in No, That's Me Over Here. Before his Monty Python days, Eric Idle was a guest star in this Britcom. It was a humble start, but he went on to become one of the most famous British comic actors of all time. Annette O'Toole as Tina in the My Three Sons episode of The Chaperones. She worked pretty steady from this point on, but her high time really seemed to be in the 1980s and 90s. You just saw her all over the place. I've always liked her as an actress. Alex Rocco as Block in 2 episodes of Batman. He had been doing movies for 2 years at this point, but this was his first thing on TV. Alex Rocco was one of those people that you always enjoyed seeing in movies and television. He was especially good at comedy roles. His look and his voice were very identifiable. He became a big name despite the fact that he was rarely ever a leading man, and he had a very long and successful career. Jan Michael Vincent as Tony Prito in The Hardy Boys, The Mystery of the Chinese Junk. This was the pilot movie for a potential TV series that didn't happen. It came shortly before his appearance in the Dragnet TV series. He also did a theatrical movie this year. Vincent had a fantastic start in show business. Things wouldn't always go this smooth for him, but he worked until 2003. Probably his most identifiable work was the action TV series Airwolf. 1967 was an incredibly interesting year for television. The hits, the misses, the stars, they can't be forgotten. Anytime you want to revisit this year, just turn on your Tell Me Vision.